So complexity of this kind demands that we use systems modelling and holistic systems modelling, because otherwise you finish up with simple models of the way the world might look into the future that in fact will very likely miss the complexities of how these things interact and affect the future. And risk management has to be done in the face of this uncertainty, so we have to get on with it and stop complaining about it. And we have to then deal with public uncertainty, because particularly the political people have to deal with the fact that not everyone in the community will either understand or want to know about these issues, and a very large proportion of the population don't want any change. They don't like change. So you have to deal with that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So here are, I think, some important messages. That when you actually try to sort through options for sustainable futures, or for dealing with a climate change issue, same thing, then it isn't simply about going and determining the cost of a potential intervention that you might make. It's a factor. Those costs, how much will it cost us to put a significant amount of solar generation into Singapore? Well, there are other issues. For some companies or some countries, we already have a whole pile of coal-fired power stations. So what do you want to do? Overnight strand those assets and make those companies go broke and make all the employees redundant? No, actually, it's quite a complex issue about how you assess the cost, particularly in view of the fact that if you look at something like solar photovoltaics, the price is coming down very rapidly, and so you also have to keep in mind that we are almost about parity now in terms of the cost of actually producing electricity from solar as with a coal-fired power station. That wasn't the case 10 years ago, and of course it influenced investment. The second thing is the technical feasibility. This comes back to the issue around can you actually install a renewable energy system based on biofuels in Singapore? Well, there are some clear physical limitations to how much you can do here, and you need to be sure that you've assessed that when you're making assessment of whether you should invest in this direction. The third thing is that some things can be done quickly and others can't. The installation of, say, a nuclear power station takes quite a long while. So you might choose to go down that direction, but you have to weigh that against the fact that it's going to take a lot longer than, say, a gas turbine if you have a gas available. And finally, in this list, there's the capacity to deliver the outcome that you're looking for, which is a more sustainable future, lower emissions and therefore lower greenhouse gases, whatever it might be. The list goes on to include a very important component that is often totally neglected, and that is you can't move forward without actually having some acceptability by the community that this is the right thing to do, because it impacts on other things like national security of supply, it impacts on human health, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment, biodiversity, and it is this issue about, are you trying to actually generate something that is in the interest of the whole community, and is the whole community Singapore or the world, or are you trying to actually just generate wealth for a company? Are you trying to generate jobs, which is often a major consideration for political parties, and do you have the political will to do this? And then finally, there's the permanency of intervention. Whatever you do now, will it be of value in the longer term? So it's a list of criteria that you can use when you go around, and some of you might be very pro photovoltaics, or you might be pro biofuels, or you might be pro nuclear, or whatever. In the back of your mind, keep in mind that you really need personally to go through this checklist, because often when you do that you find that it's not black and white, and it is a risk assessment that you're making when you do this. This example is one that I was involved with Australia, because we have this rather rapid, we have a decrease in population from natural growth, but we have a huge, over 2% growth of population per annum based on immigration. And so the simplistic thing is to say, well, we have to provide mobility for these people, and I've heard a bit of that actually in the last few days being here. But in fact, it's not that straightforward, because while you might want to do that for economic or other reasons, there are issues around fuel security out here. In Australia, we were, until a few years ago, 80% self-sufficient in oil. We are now about 65% dependent on imported oil, and by the end of this decade we'll be 80% dependent on imported oil. So there's a whole issue, which is one that's driving often policies within the US and within Western Europe, about how confident are we can get it, and the security issue. That can become, for a government, a very significant factor. But it's not that straightforward either. The price of oil is going up, and it's likely to go up a lot more. So there's an issue of balance of payments. Costs, a couple of years ago, it cost us $17 billion a year to import oil. It's now about $25 billion. It's going to keep going up. At some point in time you say, is this a good idea that we should be doing this? It is about carbon dioxide emissions. The 2,500 people a year die in Australia from motor vehicle emissions, and you'd have a similar proportional number here. So there are human health issues associated with this. Now the message of this slide is that if you really wanted a good policy outcome, you would sit down and try to derive a set of options for the future that gave you wins across every one of those. And when you sit down with the members of Parliament in the Australian Parliament, none of them wanted to hear anything about the other aspect of this. They are so isolated within their own sense of responsibility for their own portfolio that they can't actually stand back and see this wider perspective. And I think you have an advantage here, as I mentioned before, to possibly be able to do that a lot better than we do. So a few comments about the human dimensions of this. And this is something that for the vast majority of my 41 years in this area I never thought about. And I thought about it a huge amount in the last few years working with psychologists and realising that in my darkest times, thinking about how myself and my colleagues made a big mistake by not engaging with the behavioural science, social science community many years ago, 20 years ago. The IPCC process, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process, even today has a limited input from this community. And yet this is a human problem. It's created by humans and it can only be solved by humans. So why do I say that? Well, it says that as a scientist, I spent most of my life thinking that I would generate issues about climate change and sustainability in general that I would like to see used to inform risk analysis about that issue and to inform the wider community. These are in fact somewhat distinct communication paths, and that down here you would hope that public support or understanding would actually influence policy development and vice versa. There'd be an interaction here. What I never realised was this filter that exists in here is much, much more important than I ever thought. It is the fact that these messages, before they get down here, are hugely influenced by us. Both our behavioural responses, a few of which I'm going to go through and expand on in a moment, but also the institutional structures that we operate within. So let me give you a little bit more about that. As a physical scientist, perhaps one of the first things that the psychologist taught me was that if I came in and I could have given a talk here about climate science and scared you all, because there are some scary stories out there. And the first thing that they taught me was that actually within a group of people like this, no matter how homogeneous you might think you are, you won't share the same emotion when you get scared. And what's more, you will handle the emotion, whatever it is, differently than your neighbour. So this is a very important message, because it says that simply going out there and scaring the pants off people is actually not likely to deliver much of an outcome. But it also tells you that you have to deliver messages in many different ways in order to get responses. And this diagram just shows some of the emotional responses that are well understood by the behavioural science community, and the kind of coping mechanisms that people use to actually divest themselves of the emotion they don't really want to feel. And the obvious one is you deny the existence of the problem. And there's plenty of that going on around the place with regard to the climate change issue. But there are many others there. And in fact, the practical manifestation of these are words you see certainly in our newspapers every day. Climate change is not happening. Simple denial. It's actually relieves a lot of pressure, makes you feel a lot better. It's a cult of some sort. It's a mechanism whereby scientists make themselves rich. I haven't seen too much of that.